two, one, two, three.
Hi, this is Ithaca DSA Presents, and I'm David Foote, a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and host for today's program. We're going to have a conversation with Rebecca Garrard about housing, specifically New York State regulations and how they are impacting tenants' lives. Rebecca is Campaigns Manager for Housing Justice with Citizen Action of New York. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Rebecca, to begin this conversation, I wanted to talk about the history of housing legislation in New York State. What rent regulations, what protections have we seen, and how did these come about?
Yes, New York has probably, of any state in the country, the richest history of tenant protections. And so I'm excited to walk through them and want to sort of preface that conversation by flagging that we certainly still have a long way to go. So I would say New York City is where we've seen the vast majority of protections, starting well back in the 40s when rent control was enacted in New York City and many other places across the country. That lasted through 74, and it allowed tenants really for the first time to remain in their apartments with an automatic lease renewal. And the way rent control worked was that landlords had to apply for an increase. And so there was a justification that had to be shown in order for the increase to be approved. And it was in real recognition of sort of two things: the crisis of affordability, and also the idea that housing was not a commodity, but sort of a right and something that had to be insured, which is something sadly that we've moved farther and farther away from during the last 90 years, 80 years since that occurred. We had a real eroding of that during the 60s, early 70s mostly, and that system shifted to the rent stabilization system, the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, which was enacted in 1974. And so that did maintain the ability of a tenant to remain in their unit and have an automatic lease renewal. But it did guarantee an automatic increase, which was set by a Rent Guidelines Board. And during that time period, it really started the stage of a number of legislative loopholes that from 74 really through 2019 eroded the protections that were set up under ETPA in a way that made New York City lose a number of units, a large number of units that were protected under that system, and also the affordability metric that was really supposed to be insured through that system. And so 2019 really brought about, under the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, an attempt to try to reverse that. And it was successful in many ways, and there were some ways in which it really wasn't.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit more about how the 2019 legislation came about. What protections are being made into law, and how's this process adopted by counties across the state?
Yeah, so in terms of how it impacted the system that was already in effect in New York City and 3 surrounding counties, it did a lot of, it created a lot of legislative fixes to the loopholes that had been set up. So things like vacancy decontrol, which allowed for units to leave the rent stabilization system when they met a certain financial threshold. Vacancy bonus, which allowed for rents to be increased upon vacancy. We had a really, and still have, really predatory systems in MCIs and IAIs, which are major capital improvements and individual apartment increases, which incentivize landlords to make repairs that are unnecessary in order to increase rents for tenants, and also because the system is not monitored by HCR in an effective way, allows for a lot of false claims for repairs to be submitted and approved. And so we've seen rent stabilized rents increase to unaffordable levels in a really widespread manner. And so those were improved upon, but we still have a lot of work to go there. In terms of expanding the program, what was really, really significant is that there have been strict geographic restrictions on ETPA. And so as of 2019, any municipality that is eligible under the parameters, and I'll go into that in a minute, is able to opt into a rent stabilization system, and that previously had not been true. It had been limited to New York City and 3 surrounding counties. So now any of the 62 counties in the state, that any municipality that meets the criteria can opt in. And so that criteria is having a vacancy rate of 5% or less of the impacted housing stock. And the impacted housing stock is buildings built before 1974 with 6 or more units.
Okay, can you tell us about how this legislation came to be? Who were the people that helped promote it, helped pass it? How did this come to be law in New York State?
This was a really, really long-term fight that was born first of New York City tenant organizing. New York City tenant organizing has such a long, rich history, which is radical in nature. New York City tenants have fought for housing rights for a century and longer, and have really historically put their bodies on the line and sacrificed and stood up to power in order to fight for the assertion that housing is a human right. And so over the last decade especially, that organizing intensified around what was a clear erosion of these protections of the rent stabilization system that were clearly going to make this system eventually something that was not impactful in any way, shape, or form. And then starting in 2017, that organizing became a statewide effort. And so the idea was that power, right, is built in solidarity and unity. And so a really intentional organizing effort was launched by the New York City movement to reach out to tenants across the state, from Buffalo to Rochester to Syracuse to Long Island, to say, let's fight this fight together. And it was a really successful one. And it was successful because the reality is that tenants outside of New York City feel the exact same impacts that tenants in New York City feel. And so while there is not that long-standing history of tenant organizing for various reasons, right? There's a very different political climate outside of New York City. It is much harder because of the geographic challenges that are faced in areas of outside of New York City where there's not the sort of density that you have in New York City. But but the tenants face the same exact issues where there's a lack of access to affordable housing. There's a lack of access to safe, humane housing. They're subjected to predatory landlord behaviors and inhumane conditions and a lack of rights that allow them to self-advocate for repairs around those conditions. And so when that outreach started, it was a natural fit for tenants to say, yes, we want to join that fight because we're facing the same exact situations and impacts. And so the Upstate Downstate Housing Alliance was formed, and the Housing Justice for All Coalition. That campaign was born out of that. And so that consolidated power and that unified power is really, I think, what pushed that historic piece of legislation in 2019 over the finish line.
That's great. Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of unity, I think, between efforts that are happening upstate and downstate. But I think that you'd probably agree that for a lot of years now, we haven't really seen the type of legislation that we would want to see come out of our state government. What are some of the hard-won benefits of this, the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act? And what are some of the limitations that may have been, things that we just couldn't quite get into the bill?
Yeah, I'll start with the benefits. Again, I think for New York City, those loopholes that were closed were enormously impactful. The lack of the elimination of MCIs was a huge loss. And so that continues to be a fight that still needs to be fought. In addition, we really fought to have the deregulated units re-regulated. The reality is that we must bring back into the rent stabilization system the pre-1974 units that have been lost, that have been deregulated because of those loopholes. And that was not accomplished. But the units that were preserved, are going to stay at the affordability level that they are now because of the loopholes that were closed, right? Because there's not going to be mechanisms by which landlords can sort of skirt or subvert the system in order to increase rents outside of the Rent Guidelines Board increases. In terms of upstate, we have many campaigns that are moving forward ETPA expansion. We haven't so far gotten to the place in the process where a municipality has concluded the process and opted in. We are confident that that is going to happen. Certainly the pandemic has disrupted that process in numerous cities. We have Rochester that has initiated the vacancy rate study. We have Albany that has initiated the vacancy rate study, Kingston that has initiated the vacancy rate study, and numerous other municipalities that are moving in that process. So we believe that rent stabilization in a year or two is going to be something that exists in numerous upstate cities, and that's a really important bit of progress for us to have in upstate. But it's also really important to note that ETPA, while enormously impactful and extremely important for every upstate city that meets the criteria to opt into, is limiting, right? It's buildings before 1974 with 6 or more units. And so to really holistically protect tenants in upstate New York, we need something more systemic and comprehensive. And so one of the things that was left out of the 9-bill package that we were pushing in 2019 was the good cause eviction bill. And that was a huge loss. I'm going to be quite frank. That was a huge loss. So that would have impacted 5 million tenants in New York, the 3.5 million tenants which exist outside of New York City, all of whom are unregulated tenants. and 1.5 million tenants in New York City who are unregulated. And it's impactful for several reasons, right? The bill is often referred to as extremely radical, and yet it's really just a first step in evening the wildly unbalanced power dynamic between tenants and landlords. And so really what it simply says is that for a tenant to be evicted, there has to be quote unquote good cause. So non-payment of rent would qualify, damage to a property would qualify. There's even language in there for nuisance behavior. There's also language in there for if you want to evict a tenant so that a family member can move into it. That's also a carve out. And it only applies to, there's an exclusion for owner occupied buildings of 4 or less units. So if you live in a small building and you rent out the other units, you would be excluded, right, from these protections. So that's number one. We believe that no fault evictions, which are perfectly legal in this state, are unconscionable. And in a minute, I'll speak to why they're abused and how they're abused, and why that shouldn't be allowed. But it's a really, really reasonable bill in terms of the rights that it still allows for landlords. The other piece of the legislation is that it says that any rent increase above 1.5 times CPI or 3%, whichever's higher, is basically equivalent, right, to an eviction. And so you have to have some limit on rent increases in an eviction, an arbitrary eviction bill like that, or any landlord could just get around that by saying, okay, I'm not evicting you without cause, but your rent is being increased next month by 300%, right? So if you didn't have those two working together, it would be a bill with no teeth, because any landlord could simply just use that mechanism to enact a no-fault eviction by some other mechanism. But again, it's really reasonable, right? So it says there's this limit, right, on the rent increase, but it's guaranteeing a profitability metric inherently every year. But it also says if you can prove that your costs have increased beyond that, such as your property taxes have gone up, or if you need to replace the roof on the property, or anything along those lines, right, that you are allowed to go above that metric. It just simply prohibits predatory rent increases that are not based in any investment in the property or cost increase associated with the property. So you're allowed to profit on it. You're just not allowed to have this real predatory profit, when we know that in this state, 50% of renters are already rent burdened, 1/4 of renters are severely rent burdened. And so on the face, it's reasonable, right? Even if you just look at the facts. And if you sort of peel the layers back and look deeper, there's so many more reasons why it's important. What do we know about no-fault evictions, right? There's 2 reasons when they're almost always utilized. The first is in retaliation. So when we have our tenants who are our most marginalized tenants, who are in living spaces that are, never mind just not dignified, but are unhealthy, unsafe. We are talking shockingly dangerous, electrical situations that are life-threatening, lead or mold, right, that are literally poisoning families. No water, no heat, things that are just grossly unacceptable. If a tenant complains to the landlord or the city, they receive a no-fault eviction in retaliation. And so tenants do not have the ability to advocate for safe living conditions because they fear a retaliatory eviction. And so we must have these protections that say if you were, as a tenant, are fulfilling the obligations of your lease, right, are meeting the requirements of you as a tenant, that you are allowed to stay in your property for that very reason. So that's the first. The second reason that no-fault evictions are almost always utilized is to further gentrification. So we have landlords or developers who buy buildings on spec, and they quite simply just evict an entire building. So people who have lived in a neighborhood or that very building for 20 years and are doing everything they should be doing as a tenant are just given a notice for either 30, 60, or 90 days, depending on however long they've lived there, and they are displaced. Or well, we have our new developments going up in proximity to a property, and even though your unit has had no improvements made on it, just because it is close to some new development, all of a sudden your rent continues to climb and climb and climb, based not on any investment in where you live, but just because the area is improving. And not only are you displaced from your unit, but this is how we end up with communities gentrified out of their neighborhoods. And so there has to be some mechanism that begins to address the fact that when the answer to these disinvested neighborhoods is always, let's bring in investors, let's bring in development, there's never any thought to how are we going to ensure that that investment is for the benefit of the community instead of displacing the community. And that intentionality is never part of the planning process. And I have yet to see where that happens, where it doesn't eventually end up in that investment being for the community's sake. And then instead it ends up with that investment actually displacing the community and gentrifying the community. So that was a real disappointment in 2019. And it's something we still continue to fight very, very hard for.
Thank you. You mentioned the need for places to opt into the 2019 legislation and the progress that has been made in different municipalities, different areas of the state. Here in Ithaca and Tompkins County, we do have the same problems you've mentioned: gentrification of very high rents and housing costs in spite of lower incomes maybe than downstate, and as well as a few notorious buildings that are in shocking disrepair where tenants need protections. So what do places have to do to opt into this?
So for a municipality to opt into rent stabilization, ETPA, I always say the first step is the hardest step. So the first step would be to contract with an agency to conduct a vacancy rate study. And so actually the law allows for the city to conduct the vacancy rate study themselves. It's just not something we recommend because you are guaranteed that some real estate interest in your municipality will challenge it as not being independent. And so invariably you will have to pay an agency to do the study anyway. So it's like, might as well skip to that step, right? So contract with an agency to conduct the vacancy rate study. The municipality has the option to have that study ascertain the vacancy rate of the entire municipality, but it does not have to, and we don't recommend that it does. First of all, that costs more. And for a municipality to opt into ETPA, to the rent stabilization system, they only need to have a vacancy rate of 5% or less of units pre-74, of buildings pre-74 with 6 or more units. So it really doesn't matter if your single family rentals or your rentals that are 2-family are all empty. The only vacancy that matters is of those pre-74 buildings with 6 or more units. So our recommendation is to hire the agency to only conduct a vacancy study on those specific units. And that information can be obtained from the assessor's office. And there are certain things, you have to find out. You have to make sure it was residential pre-74 and not commercial. So once that vacancy comes back, and as a follow-up to this, maybe I'll flag some things that I've learned by going through the process with some other municipalities about good practices when structuring the contract with an agency and not good practices, but I'll finish this first. When that vacancy rate is determined, if it falls at the threshold of 5% or less, then the municipality can vote to opt into ETPA. There will need to be public hearings, public input, but ultimately the city can vote to opt in. If they opt in, then a rent guidelines board is set up at the county level. However, the 2019 HSTPA, Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, did say that county level rent guidelines boards should be reflective of the municipalities that have opted in. So if we take Ithaca, if Tompkins County set up a rent guidelines board and Ithaca was the only municipality that had opted in, then the rent guidelines board should be representatives from Ithaca. It shouldn't be representatives from other municipalities. As other municipalities opted in, you would want to integrate representatives from those communities, but it has to be representative of the municipalities that have opted in. And so those rent guidelines boards are 2 landlords, 2 tenants, and 5 non-affiliated members. It's a 9-person board.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm your host, David Foote, speaking with Rebecca Garrard, Campaigns Manager for Housing Justice with Citizen Action of New York. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
2, 1, 2.